The sun struck the river like a blade, shattering into 1,000 pieces of light. Its surface glittered with the cruel brightness of the tropics, as if daring anyone to step inside. Yumi stood barefoot on the muddy bank, her thin hands clutching the ragged hem of her prisoner's dress, staring at the water as though it were a trick. Around her, the other women shifted uneasily, their shadows long and fragile in the heat. They had been marched here under the watch of the Americans. Tall men in dusty khaki, rifles slung casually, as if this moment were no more significant than watering cattle. For weeks, the women had been kept behind a fence of wire, their lives reduced to queues and rations and the constant hum of hunger. They had been told by their superiors back home that this was how it would end. Capture was a fate worse than death, and Americans were beasts who would carve them apart. And yet, here they were, being handed soap. The gesture was almost insulting in its gentleness. Yumi felt the first stirrings of anger before she felt relief. Did they expect gratitude? Did they think this little act of civility could erase the shame of surrender? She had been proud once, proud of her father's service, of the flag stitched on her sleeve back when she worked in the factory sewing khaki uniforms. She had spent hours stitching seams straight as an officer's spine, believing each garment would carry her nation closer to victory. Now the empire had cracked and fallen away, leaving her in this strange limbo, neither civilian nor soldier, neither free nor punished. The river gurgled softly, as if mocking her. The air smelled of silt and wet grass, thick with insects. Somewhere upriver, a bird called, high, bright, and indifferent to their humiliation. One of the women behind Yumi began to sob quietly. Another, bolder, muttered that this must be some sort of trick. They had heard stories of prisoners being paraded to their deaths. What if this was that? The American sergeant, a broad man with sweat darkening the collar of his shirt, barked something short and impatient, then gestured toward the water. His tone was commanding but not cruel. He pointed at the soap again, pantomimed scrubbing his arms. The message was clear: go on, get clean. Yumi's feet sank into the mud as she took a step forward. The earth was warm, sticky between her toes. Behind her, the others hesitated until two of the soldiers, perhaps weary of standing guard in the heat, gestured more insistently. Slowly, as though walking into a shrine, the women began to wade into the shallows. The water was shockingly cold, a thin gasp of mountain runoff that wrapped her ankles and made her teeth ache with memory. She thought suddenly of home. The stream behind her grandmother's house where she had once washed vegetables as a child, back before the war had consumed every corner of her life. She knelt without meaning to, cupping the river water to her face, and for the first time in months she smelled something other than sweat and fear. The others followed suit, laughter breaking through their suspicion in brittle, nervous bursts. They washed their hair, their arms, their ragged dresses. One of the younger girls splashed another, then covered her mouth as if she had committed a crime. But the guards didn't stop them. One of them even grinned, teeth bright against his sunburned face, as if the sight amused him. It was unbearable, this casual mercy. Yumi wanted to hate them for it, wanted to scream that it was easier when they were monsters. But the water kept running through her fingers, slipping away no matter how tightly she cupped her hands. She scrubbed at her arms until her skin burned, as though she could wash off the memory of surrender. When she rose, her dress clinging wetly to her body, she noticed that one of the Americans had turned his back to give them privacy. The gesture confused her more than anything. Mercy she could almost explain as strategy. Clean prisoners were less likely to spread disease. But this? This was respect. And respect was dangerous. Respect could loosen the knots inside her that she had tied so carefully to keep herself standing. A dragonfly landed on her knee, its wings vibrating like a tiny engine. She stared at it, entranced, until it lifted and zipped away across the river. Something inside her shifted then, small, almost imperceptible, like the cracking of ice in spring. She realized she was no longer afraid of dying here. On the bank, the sergeant shouted again, motioning them back toward camp. The spell broke. The women waded out, dripping, carrying their wet dresses and their silence back with them. Yumi lingered a moment longer, her feet still in the current, and glanced back over her shoulder at the soldiers. One of them caught her eye and nodded once, not unkindly. The march back was quiet, the sound of their wet clothes slapping against their legs. The camp's wire fences loomed ahead, glinting in the lowering sun, but they no longer looked quite as sharp to Yumi. Something had been left in the river, something she wasn't sure she would ever get back. When they reached the gate, she turned once more to the horizon. The river shimmered there like a silver blade in the last light, promising something she did not yet understand. And in that instant, she felt the faintest tremor of fear. Not of the Americans, not of death, but of the possibility that everything she had believed about this war might already be dissolving, carried downstream where she could never retrieve it. Yumi had once worn her hair in a neat knot at the nape of her neck, the way her mother taught her. A proper woman's silhouette, respectable and precise. She remembered sitting on the narrow porch of their small house, watching the men march past on their way to the station, their bayonets glittering like 1,000 promises. The air would smell of cedar smoke and starched cotton. Neighbors would wave flags until their arms ached, shouting bonsai, until their throats went raw. In those days, it had felt impossible that Japan could ever fall. They were told they were divine, that theirs was a nation chosen by the gods, and Yumi had believed it with the purity of a child saying her prayers. When the war stretched on and the first telegrams of death arrived, the cheering grew quieter, but the devotion remained. Yumi had joined other girls at the textile factory, sewing uniforms in rooms so hot that sweat glued the fabric to their hands. She worked fast and without complaint, racing the clock, as if each finished jacket might shield some soldier from a bullet. Her supervisor would walk down the rows reminding them that every loose stitch was treason. The girls would laugh nervously, but they believed it. They believed that their needles were weapons too. It was hunger that first cracked her faith. By the winter of 1944, rice rations had shrunk to a handful a day, and Yumi's younger brother began to cough blood in the night. Bombing raids grew constant. The sky would fill with the growl of engines, and she would run with her neighbors to the shelters, pressing her hands over her ears as if she could keep the explosions out. When she emerged, there would be new gaps where houses had been, new fires painting the horizon red. When the order came to evacuate civilians from the coastal towns, Yumi did not resist. She boarded the transport ship with her mother and a handful of neighbors, standing shoulder to shoulder with other women who clutched children and bundles of clothes. The sea crossing was rough, the waves black as ink, but they arrived on an island that had been turned into a fortress, trenches, tunnels, sandbags stacked like a second coastline. Soldiers barked orders, shoving them toward the caves where they would live. There, the smell of mildew mixed with sweat and smoke until every breath tasted like damp earth. The soldiers told them that the Americans would never take the island, that if the enemy landed they must fight with bamboo spears or throw themselves from the cliffs rather than be captured. Yumi listened, her hands knotted in her skirt. She believed them because she had no other choice. The thought of capture was worse than dying. It was a stain that could never be washed away. When the invasion finally came, it was a storm unlike anything she had imagined. The shelling began at dawn, shaking the caves until dirt rained down from the ceiling. Yumi huddled against her mother, counting the seconds between blasts. The soldiers ran past them toward the front, faces set like stone, and for a while she thought perhaps the fortress would hold. But then the guns fell silent, and the shouting began, American voices, harsh and close. The defenders were falling back. The civilians were told to stay hidden, to be ready for the worst. She remembered the moment the soldiers stopped coming, when the tunnel fell quiet except for the sound of women breathing. Someone far back in the cave began to pray. Another woman tried to lead them in a song, but her voice broke. The children whimpered. Yumi's mother gripped her wrist so tightly it left a bruise. Then the Americans came. Flashlights sliced through the darkness, white and merciless. The women covered their faces, expecting bayonets. Yumi closed her eyes and waited for the killing blow. Instead, she heard strange words, clipped and commanding, but not cruel. She opened her eyes and saw one of the soldiers holding up his empty hands, showing them he would not shoot. It was bewildering, this idea that the enemy might want them alive. Some of the women still tried to run, darting for the cave mouth. A few were shot, not out of malice but because panic makes death inevitable. Yumi stayed frozen, her legs numb beneath her. The soldier gestured again, urging them forward. They were herded out like frightened animals into the blinding sun. Outside, the battlefield stank of smoke and blood. The once proud defenses were scattered wreckage. Yumi saw dead soldiers sprawled in the dust, their uniforms charred. One had a photograph of a girl clutched in his hand, the edges burned. She looked away quickly. The march to the collection point felt endless. They walked past tanks, past rows of captured guns, past American medics tending to their own wounded and to Japanese prisoners alike. The world had turned upside down. The victors were feeding the defeated, and Yumi could not make sense of it. At the barbed wire enclosure, they were counted, searched, and given canteens of water. The first sip scalded her throat with its sweetness. She wanted to hate it, to spit it out, but she drank until it spilled down her chin. Night fell, and the prisoners lay in rows on the hard ground. Yumi lay awake staring at the stars, which looked exactly the same as they had back home, as though the heavens did not care which flag flew on the island below. She could hear the guards talking quietly in English, the rhythm of their voices oddly gentle. The next day they were issued clothing, plain, coarse dresses that smelled of mothballs, and instructed to move into the camp proper. Yumi caught sight of herself in a shard of metal, hair matted, face hollowed by hunger. She did not look like the girl who once sewed uniforms with pride. She looked like a ghost who had forgotten her name. And yet, there was a strange current running through the camp, something that unsettled her almost more than fear. The guards did not leer or jeer. They treated the women with a kind of brisk efficiency, as if they were not enemies, but charges to be kept alive. One of them even offered a stick of chewing gum to a child who had begun to cry. The boy chewed it cautiously, then grinned for the first time since the caves. Yumi turned away, furious at the sight. Mercy was a luxury she could not afford. If she let it soften her, she feared she might never be able to hate again. And without hate, what was left of her country's cause? That night, as the camp quieted and the insects began their high, constant song, she felt her resolve tremble. She had survived the invasion, survived capture, survived the long walk under the rifles of strangers. She told herself she could survive this too. But survival, she was beginning to realize, was not the same as loyalty. And when dawn came, with its first orders and its first strange kindnesses, she understood with a shiver that the real battle had only just begun. The rains came first, sudden and loud, pounding the tin roofs of the camp until the ground turned to sucking mud. The women huddled inside their canvas shelters, damp and silent, watching rivulets of brown water cut through the dirt like tiny rivers seeking the sea. For days they lived in a world of wet cloth and steaming breath, the smell of mildew thick enough to taste. When the sun finally returned, it felt as though the sky had split open in mercy. The camp steamed, glistening, and for the first time since capture, the women were told to line up. Not for food, not for counting, but to be taken to the river. The guards' orders were brisk, but there was no malice in them. The sergeant gestured toward a stack of bars, pale and chalky, soap. The sight of it made Yumi's stomach clench with suspicion. Soap was a luxury she hadn't seen since the bombing raids began. She half expected it to crumble to dust in her hands. Around her, the other women murmured, wary. But the guards kept pointing, their faces growing impatient, and finally the line began to shuffle forward, down the dirt track toward the glitter of water. The river lay in a shallow valley, its surface flashing like polished steel. Dragonflies skimmed the surface, and somewhere in the reeds a heron lifted into the air with a startled cry. The air was heavy with the smell of algae and wet stones. Yumi hesitated at the bank, gripping the bar of soap until it left grooves in her palm. The current whispered around the rocks, as though calling them closer. When the first woman stepped in, the rest followed. The water was shockingly cool, a gasp against their sunburned skin. The women knelt, splashing their faces, and for a moment the air was filled with the sound of laughter, thin, nervous, but unmistakable. Yumi crouched, cupped water in both hands, and let it run over her scalp. It was more than a bath. It felt like sloughing off the last layer of fear. The guards stood back, rifles slung, watching with an expression Yumi couldn't read. They looked almost bored, as though guarding bathing prisoners were no different from standing watch over a supply truck. And yet, she noticed, they turned their eyes away when the women removed their wet clothing to wash it. One even walked a few paces upriver, giving them space. The gesture struck Yumi like a strange kindness, one she hadn't known she craved. As she scrubbed the dirt from her arms, she felt something loosen inside her chest. For weeks she had been wound tight, her thoughts a single hard knot of shame and defiance. Now, with the river lapping at her knees, she felt that knot begin to soften. She remembered the small stream behind her grandmother's house, how she and her cousins would catch minnows in their skirts and let them dart away. The memory rose so suddenly it made her throat ache. Nearby, a young girl named Keiko began to sing, her voice shy but sweet. It was an old children's song, one Yumi hadn't heard since before the war. At first the others only listened, but then one by one, they joined in. The sound floated over the water, delicate as smoke. The guards didn't interrupt. One of them even smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth twitching as though he understood more than they thought. When it was time to return to camp, the women walked back barefoot, dresses clinging to their damp bodies. The mud squelched pleasantly between their toes, and for a few precious minutes it felt almost like walking home from a summer festival, the air rich with the scent of rain-soaked earth. The sun was dipping toward the horizon, painting everything gold. That night, Yumi lay awake, her hair still faintly damp, listening to the quiet breathing of the others. The camp no longer smelled of unwashed bodies but of clean skin and river water. The difference was small, but it was everything. She felt calmer, though she could not explain why. Perhaps it was because the Americans had shown them they were not entirely powerless. They could still choose how to wash, how to sing, how to step into the river without fear. In the following days, the pattern repeated. The prisoners were taken to the river at intervals, given time to wash and scrub their clothes. Slowly, something like rhythm returned to their lives. The women began to braid each other's hair, to mend their dresses with scraps of thread. Yumi caught herself laughing once, a dry, surprised sound that startled even her. The guards, too, seemed to shift. Their orders grew less sharp, more like instructions than commands. One day, when Keiko stumbled and fell, a soldier offered his hand to help her up. The girl froze, then took it. The exchange was brief, but it left the women murmuring long into the night. And yet, not all was easy. Some of the older women whispered that these kindnesses were traps meant to break their spirit. One of them, Aya, refused to wash at all, sitting stiffly on the bank with her arms crossed. "If they want us clean," she said bitterly, "it is only because they want us to forget we are prisoners." Yumi had no answer for her. Perhaps Aya was right. Perhaps the river was a trick. But even so, Yumi could not help longing for the next time she would be allowed to step into it. Her mother noticed the change in her, the way her eyes grew distant after each bathing day. "You must be careful," she warned in a low voice. "It is easy to lose yourself when you start thinking of them as men instead of enemies." Yumi nodded, but the words felt hollow. She had already begun to notice things about the guards. The way one of them limped, the way another hummed tunelessly under his breath. They were men, whether she wanted them to be or not. One evening, after a particularly hot day, the guards allowed them extra time by the water. The sky turned violet as the sun sank, and fireflies began to flicker along the reeds. Yumi stood alone in the shallows, the current curling around her knees, and felt the strange, dangerous pleasure of being alive. When the sergeant called them back, she lingered a heartbeat longer, staring at the far bank where the trees stood dark against the sky. Something inside her whispered that the river was more than a place to wash. It was a threshold, a quiet invitation to step out of the person she had been and into someone else entirely. As she turned to follow the others back to camp, she realized with a shock that she was smiling. It was a small, secret smile, the kind that carried both guilt and promise. And though she could not yet name it, she knew that whatever waited beyond this river, beyond this camp, would demand something of her that might change her forever. At first, Yumi tried to ignore the changes. She told herself that the river was just a necessity, that the food was just fuel, that the guards' strange courtesy meant nothing. But little by little, the camp was shifting, and so were the women inside it. What had begun as mere survival was turning into something more complicated, something dangerous. The prisoners began to talk again, softly at first, then in open conversation, trading memories, sharing jokes. It was as though the river had washed the silence out of them along with the dirt. Keiko became the first to smile at one of the guards. It happened by accident. She tripped while carrying her ration tin, and the young private with the narrow shoulders caught it before it hit the ground. He grinned at her, a quick flash of white teeth, and Keiko, startled, smiled back. The moment was small, but it left the camp humming with whispers. Aya hissed that the girl was forgetting herself, that she was letting the enemy see her weakness. But that night, when Yumi lay awake, she caught herself replaying the scene in her mind. As if the smile were a forbidden song she could not stop humming. The Americans seemed to sense the shift too. They loosened the rules in ways so subtle Yumi might have missed them had she not been watching. The women were allowed to linger longer at the river, to wash their clothes without being shouted at. They were given more rations, canned peaches once, sweet enough to make Yumi cry when she tasted them. The first time Spam appeared, the women eyed it with suspicion, then devoured it as though it were festival food. Soon they began to save scraps, trading recipes, experimenting with ways to make the foreign meat taste like home. One afternoon, Yumi saw one of the guards crouch near the fence, sketching something in the dirt with a stick. She expected a crude drawing, something mocking, but when she came closer she saw a perfect rendering of a bird, a crane mid-flight, its wings stretched wide. The soldier glanced up and, perhaps seeing the recognition in her face, smiled and rubbed it out with the heel of his boot. For the rest of the day, Yumi could not stop thinking about the drawing. It unsettled her that the man who held the power of life and death over them could also be capable of such quiet beauty. The kindness, she realized, was doing something to her. It was softening the edges she had worked so hard to keep sharp. Hatred had been her armor, and now that armor was cracking. One evening she overheard Aya arguing with her mother near the shelter. "If they keep treating us like this," Aya said, "soon no one will remember why we fought." Yumi saw her mother's face in the moonlight, drawn and tired, but listening. She didn't answer. For Yumi, the struggle was more private. Each day, she woke expecting to feel the old bitterness, and each day it came back weaker, like a tide that no longer reached the shore. She began to notice the smell of the soap, sharp and almost floral, and to relish the way the cold river water made her skin prickle. She even caught herself watching the guards as they passed, wondering about their homes, their families, what had brought them to this faraway island. The camp itself seemed to grow less menacing. The wire fences no longer looked like cages but like thin, tired lines someone had drawn to mark the edge of a story that was slowly fading. The guards' boots crunched in the dust with less menace, their voices no longer clipped with suspicion. One day, the sergeant barked an order and then, almost as an afterthought, muttered something that sounded like a joke. Yumi didn't understand the words, but the tone made Keiko laugh out loud. The sergeant looked startled, then grinned. That night, Yumi felt a strange, guilty warmth spread through her. It frightened her more than the guns ever had. She wondered what her father would say if he could see her now, sitting in a captured camp, laughing at an enemy's joke. She imagined his stern face, the shame that would shadow it. For a long time she lay awake, staring at the moon through the gap in the canvas, trying to summon back the fierce certainty she once felt. The next day, a new group of prisoners arrived, thin, hollow-eyed men from another part of the island. They had been captured after a brutal skirmish, and some were wounded, limping or carried on stretchers. The women watched as the Americans gave them water, treated their injuries, even fed them before questioning. Yumi saw one of the guards kneel to light a cigarette for a prisoner whose hands were shaking too badly to hold the match. The image struck her like a blow. This was not how she had been taught war worked. Mercy was not supposed to be part of the enemy's language. Aya spat on the ground when she saw it. "It is worse this way," she said bitterly. "If they were cruel, we could endure. But this is how they make us forget we are still at war." Her words stayed with Yumi as the days passed. She wanted to argue, to tell Aya that perhaps forgetting was the only way to go on living, but she could not bring herself to say it aloud. That night, she dreamed of the crane the soldier had drawn, its wings lifting from the dust as if to escape. The river visits became almost ceremonial. The women began to tie their hair back with scraps of cloth, to sit on the bank after washing, and let the sun dry their skin. One day, Keiko waded in until the water was at her waist, then ducked under completely, surfacing with a squeal. The guards shouted, but not in anger, more like warning. Yumi felt something inside her leap at the sight. It was reckless, but it was also free. Later, as they walked back to camp, Yumi saw one of the guards glance at Keiko with something like admiration. It was a fleeting look, but it made her heart beat faster. She realized then that this camp, this routine, had become its own world, with rules that shifted day by day. The river was no longer just a place to wash. It was a place where barriers dissolved, where enemy and captive saw each other without the war's mask. That night, Yumi sat by the fence, tracing a crane of her own in the dust with a stick. When she finished, she brushed it away before anyone could see. The act left her both hollow and strangely light, as if she had confessed a secret without speaking a word. When the sergeant appeared the next morning with news, orders for transport to another camp, Yumi felt her stomach drop. The river, the fragile peace, the slow unspooling of her hatred. Soon it might all be gone. And with that knowledge came a shiver of dread, not because she feared what awaited them, but because she feared how much she had come to need what she was about to lose. The trucks came at dawn, their engines coughing smoke into the pale sky. The women were herded aboard, sitting shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches, the smell of sweat and damp cloth clinging to them like a second skin. Yumi gripped the edge of the plank until her knuckles whitened, her stomach a tight fist. The river, still silver in the early light, ran parallel to the road for a time, glinting through the trees like a companion seeing them off. She stared at it until the truck turned inland and the water vanished behind the hills. The new camp was larger, more organized, a place built not for chaos but for holding thousands. There were proper latrines, a mess tent, even a crude infirmary. The guards were different too, stricter, less familiar. The distance between captor and captive reasserted itself like a line drawn in fresh chalk. The women, who had begun to laugh and braid each other's hair by the river, fell back into silence. It was as though all the warmth of the past weeks had been left behind on the banks. But Yumi could not shake what the river had done to her. At night she dreamed of it. The feel of the current around her knees, the smell of wet grass, the strange freedom of being clean under an enemy's watchful eye. That memory followed her into the new camp like contraband, hidden but powerful. She found herself seeking small replacements for it, scrubbing her face with rainwater collected in a tin, sitting with Keiko to whisper stories of home when the guards weren't listening. One afternoon, after the women had been ordered to repair their shelters, Yumi noticed a group of American medics setting up a line of water barrels for the men's camp across the yard. When they finished, they left the spigots open for a moment to flush the dust. The sight of water running down the packed earth sent a shock through her. Without thinking, she knelt and cupped her hands under the thin stream, splashing it onto her face. The cold was electric. The other women stared, then hurried to do the same before the guards noticed. Within seconds the yard was alive with hushed laughter, a scattering of dripping faces gleaming in the sun. The guard who spotted them only shook his head, a reluctant smile flickering across his face before he barked them back to work. It was a small moment, but Yumi felt something ignite in her chest. They could still claim pieces of their humanity, even here. The river had taught her that. Weeks passed, and the war outside the fence edged toward its final chapter. Rumors swirled of a bomb that had leveled an entire city, of surrender negotiations, of an emperor who might soon speak to the people. Yumi could not imagine his voice, distant, divine, reduced to human sound. The women gathered around the scraps of news they overheard from guards, piecing together a future that might or might not exist. One evening, a guard with a soft drawl approached carrying a clipboard and read off a list of names. Yumi's was among them. They were to be processed for repatriation. The announcement sent a shiver through the group, half joy, half terror. Going home should have been simple, but Yumi felt her breath catch. Home was not the same country she had left, and she was not the same girl. On the day of departure, they were marched out of the gates for the last time. Beyond the wire, trucks waited to take them to the port. The road wound past fields greening after the rains, past trees heavy with cicadas, until it reached a low bridge. Beneath it ran a river, not the same one, but near enough in shape and sound that Yumi's throat tightened. When the convoy stopped briefly to let another truck pass, she stepped down from the tailgate, ignoring the startled shouts of the guards. She walked to the edge of the bridge and looked down. The water was swift, carrying twigs and leaves in its current, flashing gold where the sunlight struck. For a moment she imagined stepping over the rail, letting the current take her wherever it wished. Instead, she bent and dipped her hands into the river, scooping up the cold and letting it run over her face. The sensation was so familiar it hurt. Behind her, the other women began to follow, one by one, until the air was filled with the sound of splashing and quiet sobbing. Even the guards stood back, saying nothing, as if they too understood that this moment did not belong to them. Yumi straightened, droplets clinging to her chin, and turned toward the waiting trucks. Something inside her had settled, not into peace exactly, but into resolve. She knew now that she would carry this river home with her, the memory of its coldness, its freedom, its quiet invitation to change. As the trucks rumbled back to life, and the bridge fell behind them, Yumi felt no triumph, only the strange, weightless ache of someone crossing a threshold. The war was ending, but something else was beginning, something just as vast and uncharted. The river had not merely washed her clean. It had carried her across, leaving her standing on a new shore, a citizen of a country that did not yet exist. And as the horizon opened before her, she realized with a sudden, quiet certainty that the current of this new world would be impossible to resist. Which city are you watching our video from? For more powerful stories from World War II, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thank you.